we never let go of our roots, right? And the sovereignty was really important to stay here in the U.S. And then as we scaled and we got to a more disruptive cost advantage, then we said we're going to scale here in the U.S. because this is one of our primary markets. So we had one factory is what we started with here in the U.S. And now when we complete with South Carolina, we'll have created 6 factories here in the U.S.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. We decided last minute to make this a live podcast recording. So thank you to Mark and to Jen and the rest of the First Solar team for pulling this together. It's great. We actually just got the chance to meet about an hour ago. I've been out in seen your facility in Perrysburg. Some of the members of my team have visited your facility in Louisiana, and it sounds like we've got plans to visit some of the others as well. But sort of as an introduction for everybody here and everybody that's going to be listening online after, what was your introduction to not just First Solar, but also to the solar industry in general?
Yeah, so it's about 15 years ago. All right, so the first, I was working obviously in another industry, more of an industrial industry, and had previously been in the high-tech industry when I was with Dell during the 90s, and kind of very exciting growing industry. And First Solar was starting to evolve at that point in time. So we were talking close to around 2010, and a lot of excitement. It was this unique company with this unique technology, right? Differentiated capability, disruptive in many different ways, and focused on manufacturing, creating supply chains, here in the U.S. and abroad. So it was this great field for me and fit, and culture, and something I was very excited to join the company 15 years ago, first as a CFO, then about 10 years ago I became CEO.
And what does First Solar actually do? Like, why is it so different from so many of the other solar manufacturers?
Yeah, so we're basically a semiconductor company. That's what we are, right? So the semiconductor sits between 2 sheets of glass and converts photons into electrons, right? But we do it in a completely disruptive way. We do it with a thin film processing that nobody else in the world has ever done. We're the only one able to get it to scale and to be competitive. And it's an advantage technology that can outcompete alternative sources of PV generation or semiconductors, which largely is an old legacy technology that it was a very proud moment that this was created here in the U.S., but eventually evolved to being dominated by the Chinese. And unfortunately, it's really First Solar against China at this point in time. So there's 2 technologies in the world. We're thin film, we're vertically integrated. You saw our factories. Everything that is manufactured in the 4 walls of that factory creates this vertically integrated product that ships out the back end. CapEx advantage, energy advantage. So it has many, many attributes which makes it a compelling advantage, disruptive technology we've been able to create, and also creates a platform for evolutions to continue to come and next generation thin films.
And have you guys been, specifically a U.S. manufacturer the entire time? Or was that a particular, at some point in time, you guys decided to change your mindset about the industry in general?
Yeah, so we've started the company here in the U.S. Again, we're a technology manufacturing company, and the symmetry between those two is very important. So as you think through your advanced early stage development and eventually to advanced development and moving that into high volume manufacturing, having R&D co-located with manufacturing is a huge strategic advantage. So we've always maintained true to that. Now, we have put factories outside of the U.S. when there was such a objective of moving to driving the levelized cost of energy down for solar. Like most people, there was exploration that was done at that point in time to look to manufacture outside of the U.S., but we never forgave or we never let go of our roots, right? And the sovereignty was really important to stay here in the U.S. And then as we scaled and we got to a more disruptive cost advantage, then we said we're going to scale here in the U.S. because this is one of our primary markets. So we had one factory is what we started with here in the U.S., and now when we complete with South Carolina, we'll have created 6 factories here in the U.S.
And I've seen these because Jen is so great about sending them to me. These clips of you talking about how important American manufacturing is on, Fox Business and so on. And I'm curious about your ideological evolution on the trade and reindustrialization piece in particular, because it's obvious that you're very passionate about that and about all the great people that you employ, many of whom, I've gotten the chance to meet visiting some of your facilities. But how did that happen for you? Like, what was your radicalizing moment?
So I grew up in a town south of Indiana, which is not that far from here, right? And and most people know South Bend because of the University of Notre Dame. The reality was South Bend started off as really a great manufacturing company. There was a lot of industry, in South Bend, going all the way back to Oliver Plow, right? That eventually then became Studebaker wagons, and ultimately became Studebaker cars. And then Bendix came there, right? So aircraft wheels and brakes, and we had Dodge and Wheeler, and all these really large, really successful industrial companies. And my grandparents, my aunts and uncles used to tell the stories about the factories, and they're all gone, right? They're now mostly just shuttered up old facilities and broken windows. And so growing up in that environment and experiencing that, it really informs your view of, if you were ever in that position to get back, what would you do? And so having the opportunity, being the CEO of First Solar, as we thought about expanding manufacturing, I said, absolutely, we're going to do it here in the U.S. And we're going to do it. We're going to out-innovate. We're going to do it cost competitively and advantage ways, and we're going to thrive. We're going to continue to invest in communities. We've kind of taken those kind of premises and principles, and we've gone into communities, which makes me extremely proud. For example, we went into Alabama because the community that we were in and outside of Huntsville was devastated about a decade plus ago with a paper mill that was shut down and all those jobs went to China. And it's largely been in economic depression for over a decade until First Solar comes. First Solar comes, we invest, we put a factory in outside of Huntsville. It was over $1 billion investment. We hire about 800 associates for that facility. Average pay is around $80,000 for that facility. Now this economy now in the community is thriving again. When we go there, which is a proud moment for us, when we go there and have a chance to interact with some of the associates, they'll tell us about how thankful they are for First Solar making a commitment and investing in the American worker, right? And that's what we're here to do, right? Taking our technology, investing in the American worker, creating the domestic supply chains, and creating that economic prosperity. So for me, it just started with my upbringing, and then continuing to push my team, a very, very talented team, about how do we manufacture here in the U.S., how do we do a cost advantage.
Are there any cool stories, and this can be, on an individual basis or on a community basis, of like things that have happened because, like I think about Perrysburg in particular, like what was it like before the factory was there versus what it's like now?
Yeah, so Perrysburg was another community that was kind of going through, an industrial transition, right? And largely an automotive industry, right? Supply chain that sat in Perrysburg. And really the technology, the evolution of the technology was trying to find an alternative use of glass, right? So glass obviously was being used in the automotive industry, but they were trying to find other ways to use glass. And so then this technology came in and said, well, we can deposit a semiconductor on top of the glass. That semiconductor then can create electrons. And so by doing that, now we have an opportunity to invest in that community, and glass is really important. And the glass industry largely has gone to China as well. So there's kind of two different types of glass, more of a commoditized glass and more of a high-end glass. And all that industry largely has gone to China. So we made a decision to put our second factory in Perrysburg, Ohio. We needed a glass supply chain. And this was around 2020 or so. And we hadn't built a new glass facility in the U.S. for 50 years. So we worked with our supply chain partner. We co-invested with them to put a new glass facility, which is about a couple of miles from our current facility. Therefore, we could source that glass locally. The other thing that we've done is they also have one of the oldest glass facilities in Rossford, Ohio. 100-plus-year-old facility that was largely mothballed. And we made an investment to bring that back into production. Okay? And so we have theory, we were getting glass from the oldest facility in the U.S. and the newest facility in the U.S., and we basically buy about 20% of the glass that is made in the U.S. We're the largest buyer of glass compared to the automotive industry or anywhere else. We buy 20% of that.
Wow. And, there is a certain part of that, the credit for all of those jobs too, that also comes back to First Solar. That's awesome. I think the reason that we're supposed to be having this conversation is about, AI integration in manufacturing. You guys first started implementing this in 2022. I've seen it with my own eyes. It's insane. It kind of blew my mind. But, paint a picture for everybody else here. What does it actually look like on the shop floor?
Yeah, so we brought it to full scale in production around 2022. We started to actually make decisions to invest in it about 3 years earlier than that, but it's fully in production, it's operational, and it's been scaled across all of our factories. And really, it's taking the full entitlement capabilities of robotics, the full entitlement capability of, you think about every tool that we have has some form of chip, some PLC associated with it, taking those opportunities and leveraging it to create digital twins so we can now optimize and do throughput analysis, yield analysis, relay out the factory in a digital environment and then implement that into a production environment. And so when you go out on our shop floor is about 2 million square feet, and it's highly automated and automatic guided vehicles for all material movement, conveyor belts moving product from one location to the next. The module, when it's put in production, it'll travel about 4 or 5 miles to its end destination, and it'll be completed in about 4 hours. Well, when you look at the scale that we have across our factory footprints that we make a module in every 1 second. So somewhere around the world, in about every 1 second, there's a completed module that's coming off. And we do that with the highest standards around quality and reliability. Every module that goes through the production process, there's visual cameras, track units, so there's even a stress factor in the glass will be then identified. Every module has its own kind of digital footprint associated with it and information associated with it in terms of how that module went through the production process. So it's really taking to advance next generation manufacturing. There's not one person. Invite everybody here in the room to come see one of our factories. They're obviously generally close by. There's not one person who's ever left our factory that hasn't had a similar reaction that you did. Because it's inspirational seeing what we can do here in the U.S. and what next generation technology can look like.
Well, yeah, I spent a lot of time with folks that work on these sorts of issues in DC, maybe working for the administration or on the Hill or whatever. And I think the sense in DC is like, oh yeah, this is a thing that is like starting to happen. Some people, small scale are starting to use AI in manufacturing. It is very obvious for you guys that this is not a pilot program. You've gone all in on it. Do you think this is the future?
Absolutely. And we're also moving forward to really because AI is a critical enabler of adding value to our production associates, right? So helping them do their job better, right? Not trying to replace their jobs, but trying to figure out how can they do their jobs better. So, for example, if an operator is operating a particular piece of equipment and there's some form of sensor that goes off, well, historically, we potentially maybe would have deployed a technician to come out and try to observe and determine what happened with that tool. Now what we do is empower the operator to determine what happened, right? AI tools can help them do their own kind of breakdown analysis to determine what's the root cause of the problem and then correct it themselves. So there's a huge empowerment aspect of this, and it's only going to get evolved forward. It's only going to get better as we go. And what you'll find is what's really cool about AI is that associates that are using it at all levels across our company, it's opening their minds to new possibilities, things they didn't fully comprehend before or understand what they could do and how they could be empowered. Now they're like, wow, this is such a powerful tool that I can use to help do my job better, to improve quality, the performance of the product, and drive out costs. And that's what our associates are trying to do.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that the jobs that people have at First Solar in Ohio and Louisiana average like $80,000 a year. Who is that average person? Like what were they doing before First Solar came to town, and what is their skill set now that they work for you?
It's interesting because I don't know if there's a profile you could look at across all of our factories to say this is the standard profile. But it's the standard profile of the associates that were in that community. So if I go to Louisiana, a lot of the associates that we brought in from Louisiana are generally somehow tied to the oil and gas industry because that's what was there before. The community that was in Alabama, a lot of those more rural, in some cases even from a farming community, and this experience and background, right? But what we do is we find highly passionate, capable associates who want to learn, and then we invest a lot of time in training them, right? So we give them the skills of what they need to know and understand in order to do their job. We work very closely with the community colleges in particular, and the universities in particular. So we're bringing some of these associates up very kind of early in their career, putting them through certain curriculum and certain schools to help prepare them for the jobs that they would have at First Solar. In other cases, we're just bringing from the capability that exists already in the community and then training and develop them to operate these tools. But clearly the jobs are becoming more technical. But we also determined or found that it's very easy with proper training that people can upskill themselves very quickly.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of anxiety about AI replacing those jobs, and this is not just email jobs or whatever. It's also in manufacturing. Like there may be some people listening to this later thinking that integrating AI into your manufacturing process is automatically going to decrease the amount of jobs. I think you guys are actually a case study that this is not true. You have built out this entire new system and process, and you have added more facilities and more jobs. Can you paint the picture of like how you did that and what sort of roadmap that creates for other manufacturers in different industries?
Yeah, so I think that we always like to say that we take a step back and if you think about our complete ecosystem, which we intentionally determined that we needed to create an ecosystem that's here in the U.S. And I already referenced the glass, and it's rightly so you indicated that those are indirect jobs are really there and enabled by us. The entire output of those glass ones goes 100% to First Solar. So when you look at what we've been able to do across the supply chain, that includes steel and aluminum and plastics and different types of materials, including copper and other things, we've created 40,000 jobs here in the U.S. That's what we've been able to do, and we've created about $4 billion of annual payroll, right? And what we really are trying to do is bring it back to the AI piece of it. We're also trying to integrate those capabilities and create a seamless integration across the entire ecosystem so we can leverage each other's know-how and capability to drive more throughput and scale appropriately given the opportunities that we have in the marketplace. As I indicated, this is not about how do we replace these jobs. It's about how do we upskill and how do we create the capabilities that we need for next generation technology and how do we compete on a global stage. I mean, we all know that China's out to dominate and really replace the U.S. in terms of our supply chain and our capabilities. They would prefer that 100% of all of our critical strategic supply chains would resonate and be controlled in China, right? So we're trying to figure out how do we ensure that never happens. But what do I have to do to make sure that I can get to on a level playing field where I can out innovate and out compete them? And so there is a huge component of technology, but technology enabled by associates and their vision, their passion, their commitment, and innovation and creativity. They can ultimately get us there.
And so to put a finer point on this, you would say that AI has helped you to upscale more quickly than you otherwise would be able to.
Absolutely. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And as I indicated, the passion, the power, and the insights that has been given to our associates has made them significantly more productive and actually significantly improved their engagement in terms of wanting to come in every day and contribute, right, and to win. And that's really what it's about, is how do we win?
Yeah. You brought up China a second ago. Chinese silicon obviously is a big issue in this industry. Paint a picture for us, just how dominated is the rest of the solar industry by, Chinese raw materials.
Yeah, unfortunately, the crystalline silicon is an alternative technology to us. Unfortunately, it really lost its way and it gave up. It wasn't that it was outcompeted. It just gave up and it handed its technology and its supply chain to China. And China also had, as part of its 5-year strategic planning process, this was an industry that it wanted to dominate. And so it was very willing to take it. And then what ended up happening is that it's not just the technology that has gone there, the manufacturing capacity has gone there, the tools that are needed in order to manufacture the product, the supply chain that are needed, the entire ecosystem has gone to China. And if you look across parts of that supply chain for crystalline silicon, again, we're completely different. Our technology sits outside of that. In some cases, 98% of the supply chain is controlled by China, and almost all the tools that are needed to manufacture the product really sit in China as well. So they control, as I like to refer to as kind of that on-off switch a little bit, right? So they can make decisions. And it's this weird evolution. A second on this as well, is that it's like when solar was first around, and even when you had this moment of liberation that everybody had access to. So instead of being dependent upon natural resources within the country that you have, right, being blessed by having natural resources that can enable energy, long-term energy independence, as an example, solar and wind sort of was available for everyone. China now has taken it and sort of just turned the game around. They control the switch. On the crystalline silicon side, if they don't want to export the materials or export the tools or give the IP, you can't do anything. You have no sovereign control anymore because China is now in that position. That's the vulnerability that has been created with the silicon side. We've chosen never to get close to that. We've never given them our technology. We've never given them our ecosystem as it relates to our supply chain or our tools which are manufactured. We've kept control of all that, so we've created and enabled our independence to not be encumbered by that.
Yeah, but for the rest of the industry, that's a pretty bleak picture. Do you think that it is possible at this point in time for the United States to beat China on energy? And where's the gap? What's the thing that's not being fixed right now?
Yeah, it's absolutely possible, right? You have to have the commitment first, right? And there's two countries that are trying to move in that direction right now. One is the U.S., obviously, and I'll talk about that. The other is India. India has done the same thing they're concerned about their over-reliance, right? And so they're trying to enable and create their domestic industry. And that's what it is, it's a commitment. And then you also have to have strong enforcement. So there's no reason that we can't have our own domestic industry here. Today, we supply about 50% of the demand for the U.S. market, okay? And we have not only today's technology, but next generation technology that is superior and competitive advantage to anything crystalline silicon can do. But there's that commitment, and then there has to be a level playing field. And once you give us a level playing field, we'll thrive, right? We know that, right? We've demonstrated that. But the problem is with the Chinese is they'll continue to find ways to circumvent that level playing field. And what we need to make sure is that once we create that level playing field is that there's enforcement. And I love the fact that the fundamental principles of capitalistic model, as I said, love it, right? Economic prosperity, return on capital, right? Technology evolution. The problem is sometimes others aren't always aligned to the spirit of that objective, which means ensuring sovereignty of your supply chain. Some people feel like I just have an American address and I get everything from the supply chain independency from China, and I circumvent kind of the standards and the requirements. And that happens today, unfortunately, and it pisses me off. Right? It really gets under my skin. And our government isn't always there to stand by and enforce that, right? And those should not happen. Because we need to have our own long-term capabilities here, and it has to be true capabilities, not entitled or dependent upon any portion of the supply chain or any adversary country.
Yeah, we're in the era of drill baby drill. It's the golden age. I think that there are still a lot of particularly young conservatives that are skeptical of solar. And again, like I've been to see your facility. I'm totally sold. I think it rocks. But for the skeptics, make your 3 to 5 minute case for why the solar industry matters.
And what we like to do is take drill baby drill and turn it into build baby build. Right? It's about building. Right? That's what we need to do. And we're in a race right now, in particular around AI. We're behind a little bit as it relates to our grid, which is not in the state that it needs to be to enable the generation of the load growth that we see. And we don't have enough electrons. China's ahead of us in both regards. We need electrons. We need to build, baby, build. We need to win the AI race as an example. We need to reindustrialize, right? All that needs to happen here in the U.S. None of us want to be vulnerable. Think about what happened with China controlling, magnets as an example, almost completely shut down our automotive industry, right? Because they make one decision. They turn the switch off, right? And they're not going to supply, and it becomes even a small component like that can completely undermine our automotive industry, right? So we need to have those abilities and capabilities here in the U.S. So build, baby, build needs to be there. Electrons are needed. Solar has a very compelling value prop. It's kind of like we need all of the above energy strategy, right? We shouldn't be disparaging any type of electron because we need more of them. We need to get them onto the grid. And it's kind of like looking at the various branches of military, right? You need the Army. You need the Navy as an example, right? You need the Marines. You go on down the line, right? They all work together, right? They all complement each other, and they all add value. And if you think about from what do utilities want? First off, they have an obligation to serve, and they want reliable, affordable power, right? Solar's fastest to build. It's the lowest cost form of energy, and it is extremely reliable. I understand even when the sun comes up at 7, it goes down at 7 p.m. During that period of time, highly reliable and predictable. And by the way, with the integration of batteries, now you can use that to dispatch that into the evening hour. But that's just a part of the overall stack, right? Natural gas plays a role. Nuclear's going to play a role. Wind will play a role. Geothermal will play a role. You need that element of diversification. You need more electrons, and then you need to optimize that to best serve the load requirements at the most affordable cost.
What's the biggest use case for solar panels, the modules? Like in terms of generalizing, like the average customer that you get.
So, well, the average customer we have, so we pretty much is all utility scale. And if you look at, these are very large solar projects that are being built, generally in more remote locations. A lot of them are there either grid connected or behind the meter, especially for the data center. So we're starting to see now, because the grid's a constraint, one of the things you can do now is you can co-locate the generation. In some cases, you have a hybrid system where some of it's grid power and some of it's off grid. In some cases, you're creating a microgrid around the data center. That enables that time to power opportunity, and solar is the fastest to power, right? And the most economical from that standpoint. So that's kind of the value prop that we provide to our customers. Today, a lot of the hyperscalers are made significant investments in procuring the chips. In some cases, they've built out the facilities. They don't have power, right? We can give them power. We can give them the fastest. We can either grid connected or we can do off grid. Those are all kind of degrees of freedom that enable options to our customers that they can optimize.
A lot of the folks that are going to be listening to this after this conference work in DC. They're maybe a freshly minted political appointee. Maybe they work for a committee on the Hill or a member or something like that. What do you think is the biggest thing that staff in DC misunderstand not just about solar industry, but the solar industry, but reindustrialization in general?
I think what I really like about, when we start getting in newer members, right, that understand the art of the possible, right? Unfortunately, I think in some cases we still have members that are somewhat close-minded and they've seen what happened in the past and they've seen, the evolution of our industrialization and people kind of at that point in time feel like, well, we lost and we can't get it back. And that just frustrates me because that's couldn't be further from the truth. And it goes back to my comment before about, it starts with a commitment. And once you make that commitment, the American worker is strong. The American worker is innovative, right? The American worker is passionate. If you can take leaders and have them run companies that have a strategic lens towards that type of commitment, sometimes, unfortunately, companies are run just on a simple return on investment decision that governs everybody's mindset. And nobody thinks through the longer term strategic implications and the value creation that we can create by doing things here. And then the long term independence that we get by controlling the supply chain. So I think that's part of it. And I think the other piece of it is, and I'll go to mining and refining as an example. If anyone thinks that, first off, it's absolutely critical and strategic. We need to have the mining capabilities and the refining capabilities. We need to keep the rare earths and critical metals here in the U.S. They shouldn't be going over to China and allow them to control that portion of the supply chain. But anyone thinks that it's being done in some environmentally friendly way or not using forced labor or whatever it is in China, they're foolish. And we know if we do things like that here in the U.S., we'll do it the right way. We'll create those strategic components of our supply chain, that ecosystem that will allow us to compete and allow us to thrive for centuries to come. If we choose to ignore it today and we aren't willing to make those commitments, future generations, the vulnerabilities that they will face, because we no longer have basic capabilities to build things, we no longer have the basic supply chains in order to make investments that need to be made in doing things here in the U.S. Once you let it go, what we just saw on the crystal silicon side, it's really hard to get it back. So we can be vulnerable to that. We got to be committed today. We got to look across the horizon. We got to look, what do we need to do 5, 10, 15 years from now? And we can't keep having, every couple of years, new administrations come in and then there's a political whipsaw that goes back and forth. We need to stay true to a strategy that we can invest around and be committed to looking at what's the best interest for the United States, not just in the next 4 years, but over the next 4 decades.
Let's say that we made you Reindustrialization Czar of America for one day. You can implement one policy that you think will jumpstart us solving this problem. What is that policy?
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? In terms of one policy, but I would say the policy has to be approaching this from get out of the way, get government out of the way, right? And allow the investments to be made here in the U.S. And we'll do the right thing. It's kind of like even on there's some processes that you'll see in certain regional territories, like in the Northeast, where there's this long interconnection queue process that has to happen, right, in order to connect to the grid. Texas is kind of like said, here, go ahead and connect, right? Just go ahead and do it, and then if there's an issue around it, we'll let you know, right? So they're trying to step back and allow it to happen. In some of the regions, you'll be very bureaucratic and they want to do, 5, 6, 7 years, interconnection studies before they determine whether you can connect at all. And that's just a waste of time and bureaucracy, which generally doesn't add any value. And it just slows things down. And we just need, let's go. So if I had any one wish, so government step back, allow companies to invest, allow them to make, the investments they need to. And generally, companies and corporations are well-intended. Right? They'll do the right thing. And as long as they're doing it and they're creating prosperity, creating jobs here in the U.S., as long as they're not moving jobs offshore, let them go do it. Do the right thing. Invest in America. That would be my high-level theme. How that ties into one policy. We'll have to debate that one, but more or less get out of the way.
Can we give a warm round of applause to Mark?
Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier and Hunter Smith, with original graphics and title cards by Jared Cummings. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is americanmoment.org.